I'm Brian, 58 years old, and I spent 27 years building my industrial ventilation systems design business here in Richmond, Virginia. When the pawn shop owner called me about someone trying to sell my late wife's diamond bracelet, I felt my blood turn to ice. By the time my stepchildren returned from their 2-week luxury vacation to Belize, they discovered their credit cards had been canceled, their car payments suspended, and the apartment leases I'd been covering were terminated with 30 days' notice. My wife Harper died 14 months ago from a sudden heart attack that nobody saw coming. One day she was laughing at our kitchen table, planning our 25th wedding anniversary trip, and 3 days later I was picking out her casket. The grief nearly destroyed me, but I thought at least her 2 children would help me through the darkest period of my life. Instead, I learned they'd been treating her death like winning the lottery. Harper had 2 kids from her first marriage when we got together. Zane, who's 31 now and works sporadically as a freelance graphic designer, and his sister Luna, 28, who bounces between part-time jobs while claiming she's finding herself. For over 2 decades, I'd been the one providing stability for this family. When Harper's ex-husband disappeared and stopped paying child support, I stepped up without hesitation. I put both kids through college, covered their car insurance, helped with rent when they couldn't make ends meet, and never once made them feel like they owed me anything. My ventilation systems business specialized in designing air filtration and climate control for manufacturing plants, data centers, and pharmaceutical facilities throughout the Mid-Atlantic region. It's technical work that most people don't understand, but when a semiconductor plant needs precise air quality control or a chemical facility requires specialized fume extraction systems, they call me. I'd built a reputation for solving complex airflow problems that other engineers couldn't handle, and my client list included some of the biggest industrial operations on the East Coast. The money was excellent. I was pulling in around $200,000 a year during my peak earning period, and I'd invested wisely. Harper and I owned our 4-bedroom colonial home outright, worth about $450,000 in today's market. I had a solid 401k with nearly $800,000 saved, plus a whole life insurance policy worth $300,000 that named Harper as the primary beneficiary. When she died, that money transferred to her estate, which according to Virginia law and our will meant it would eventually go to her children. But apparently, waiting for me to die naturally wasn't moving fast enough for Zane and Luna. The morning that pawn shop call came in, I was sitting in my home office reviewing blueprints for a new pharmaceutical cleanroom project in Norfolk. The owner, a guy named Marcus who ran Richmond Gold and Silver Exchange on Broad Street, sounded nervous when he introduced himself. He said a young man and woman had come in trying to sell what looked like expensive jewelry, but something felt off about the whole transaction. The girl had this diamond tennis bracelet, Marcus explained, and she kept saying it belonged to her grandmother who just passed. But when I asked for documentation or asked about the insurance appraisal, she got real defensive. Then I noticed the engraving inside. It says, "To Harper, forever yours, Brian," with a date from 15 years ago. My hands started shaking as I realized what he was telling me. That bracelet cost me $12,000 for Harper's 40th birthday. She wore it to every special occasion we ever attended, and I'd specifically requested it be buried with her because she treasured it so much. The funeral director had assured me that her jewelry would remain with her. "Sir, are you still there?" Marcus asked. "Because I've got them on my security cameras and I told them I needed to verify the authenticity before making an offer. They're supposed to come back tomorrow morning with more pieces." I thanked Marcus and hung up, then sat in stunned silence as the horrible truth began crystallizing in my mind. They hadn't just taken Harper's jewelry from her casket. They were systematically stripping away everything that connected me to the woman I'd loved for over 2 decades. That evening, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about Harper's funeral, remembering how Zane and Luna had cried so convincingly at the graveside service. They'd hugged me afterwards, telling me how much they loved me and how grateful they were that I'd taken care of their mother. Luna had even said she considered me more of a father than her biological dad ever was. It was all performance, apparently. I decided to drive out to Woodland Cemetery at dawn to confirm my worst fears. The groundskeeper, an older gentleman named Pete, who'd worked there for 30 years, remembered me from the burial. When I explained my concerns, his expression grew troubled. "Mr. Bryan, I hate to tell you this, but we've had some issues lately with people claiming to be family members and requesting access to burial sites for personal closure," Pete said, unlocking the maintenance shed to retrieve some paperwork. About 6 weeks ago, a young man and woman showed up here with what looked like legitimate documentation saying they were Mrs. Harper's children and needed to place some additional memorial items in the casket. My stomach dropped. You opened the casket. They had signed affidavits and copies of the death certificate. The young woman was crying, saying she'd forgotten to include her grandmother's ring that Harper had always wanted to be buried with. They seemed so genuinely grief-stricken, and they had all the right paperwork. Pete shook his head in disgust. I should have called you first, but they insisted it was supposed to be a surprise, that you'd been through enough stress and they wanted to handle this family matter themselves. I felt sick imagining Zane and Luna standing over Harper's casket, systematically removing every piece of jewelry I'd given her over the years. The diamond engagement ring that cost me 2 months' salary when I proposed. The pearl necklace I'd surprised her with for our 10th anniversary. The gold watch I'd bought her when she got promoted to senior accounting manager. They'd violated not just my trust, but Harper's final resting place. How much did they take? I asked, though I dreaded the answer. Pete pulled out a folder with photos taken during the reinterment process. Standard procedure is to document everything when we reopen a burial site. According to these photos, they removed approximately 12 pieces of jewelry, including rings, necklaces, bracelets, and earrings. The woman claimed they were family heirlooms that needed to be redistributed among surviving relatives according to Harper's wishes. The total value of Harper's jewelry collection was probably close to $60,000. Not just the monetary worth, but the sentimental value of every piece that represented a milestone in our relationship. Our first Christmas together, her birthday surprises, anniversary celebrations, promotions and achievements we'd celebrated as a couple. I thanked Pete and drove home, my mind racing with implications. If Zane and Luna were desperate enough to rob their own mother's grave, what else had they been planning? I started thinking about all the times they'd asked seemingly innocent questions about my business finances, my retirement accounts, and my estate planning. Luna had even suggested I should update my will recently, claiming she'd learned about estate law in one of her college courses. Back home, I went through Harper's personal papers more carefully than I had since her death. Hidden in her jewelry box, I found something that made my blood run cold. A handwritten note in Harper's distinctive script that said, "Brian, if anything happens to me, please know that Zane has been asking questions about your life insurance policy. He doesn't know I heard him on the phone talking about it. Be careful, I love you. H." Harper had suspected something was wrong with her children, but she died before she could warn me properly. Now I understood why she'd seemed so stressed and withdrawn in those final weeks, despite the pain medication. She'd discovered their plans but couldn't bring herself to confront them directly. I spent the rest of that day researching private investigators and forensic accountants. If Zane and Luna thought they could manipulate a grief-stricken widower into funding their lifestyle while they planned my demise, they'd severely underestimated who they were dealing with. I hadn't built a successful engineering business by being naive or trusting people at face value. By Monday morning, I'd hired Patricia Henley, a former FBI agent who now ran a private investigation firm specializing in financial fraud and family theft cases. Within 48 hours, she'd uncovered a paper trail that made me sick to my stomach. Zane and Luna had been systematically planning their inheritance strategy for over 2 years, starting long before Harper got sick. Patricia's investigation revealed that Luna had been working part-time at an estate planning law firm in downtown Richmond, not the coffee shop she'd told us about. She'd been learning about Virginia inheritance laws, probate procedures, and life insurance policies. Meanwhile, Zane had been researching my business finances through public records, trying to determine the exact value of my company and personal assets. "They've been building detailed financial profiles on you for months," Patricia explained, spreading documents across my kitchen table. "Look at these printouts from your bank's website. Someone's been accessing your online statements using a computer registered to Luna's apartment. They know exactly how much you have in checking, savings, your 401k balance, even your business operating accounts." The violation felt worse than the grave robbery. They'd been studying me like a mark, calculating my net worth while I grieved their mother's death. Patricia showed me email exchanges between Zane and Luna discussing my spending habits and approximate timeline for natural death based on family history and stress levels. "Here's where it gets really disturbing," Patricia continued, pulling out a manila folder. "They've been in contact with a life insurance agent about increasing your policy coverage. Luna apparently told this agent she was your stepdaughter and was concerned about your financial protection following Harper's death. She scheduled a consultation for next week. I felt my hands clench into fists. They want to take out more life insurance on me? It appears so. And based on these credit card statements I was able to access through legal channels, they've been living far beyond their means for the past 8 months. Luna's got $12,000 in credit card debt, and Zane owes $23,000 between multiple cards and a personal loan. They're drowning financially, and you're their life raft. The evidence kept getting worse. Patricia had discovered that Zane had been researching accidental death benefits and double indemnity clauses in life insurance policies. He'd even visited websites about heart attack symptoms and stress-related cardiac events in men over 55. Luna had been researching Virginia's inheritance laws for surviving stepchildren and had downloaded forms for challenging wills in probate court. They're not just stealing from you now, Patricia said grimly. They're planning to accelerate their inheritance timeline significantly. That afternoon, I called Marcus at the pawn shop to confirm that Zane and Luna were still planning to return with more jewelry. He said they'd scheduled an appointment for Thursday morning and had mentioned bringing additional family pieces, including what sounded like Harper's engagement ring and wedding band, items I specifically remembered being buried with her. I spent Wednesday putting my own plan into motion. First, I contacted my estate planning attorney, Jonathan Mills, and completely revised my will. Everything I'd previously left to Zane and Luna now went to the American Cancer Society and the Richmond SPCA, organizations Harper had supported during her lifetime. I also added a specific clause explaining the reason for the change, documented with Patricia's investigation findings. Next, I called my life insurance company and added a fraud alert to my policy, making it impossible for anyone to make changes or request increases without my personal appearance and notarized documentation. I also requested copies of all inquiries made about my policy in the past 12 months. Then I visited my banker and restructured all my accounts, removing any joint access I'd previously given to Harper that might have transferred to her estate. I set up new accounts with different passwords and security questions, and arranged for all statements to be sent to a post office box that only I could access. Finally, I contacted the funeral home and cemetery to file formal complaints about the unauthorized grave tampering. The funeral director was horrified when I explained what had happened and immediately offered to coordinate with police to document the theft and desecration. By Thursday morning, I was ready to spring my trap. Patricia and I arrived at the pawn shop 30 minutes before Zane and Luna's appointment, and Marcus let us wait in his back office where we could observe through a one-way window and record everything that happened. At exactly 10:30 Thursday morning, Zane and Luna walked into Richmond Gold and Silver Exchange carrying a small velvet jewelry box that I recognized immediately. Harper had kept her most precious pieces in that box on our bedroom dresser for 15 years. Watching them casually stroll in with her treasures, laughing about something on Luna's phone, made my chest tighten with rage. Patricia adjusted the recording equipment while I watched through the one-way mirror. Luna was wearing a designer handbag I'd never seen before, probably a $2,000 Prada bag based on my quick research of luxury brands after seeing their credit card statements. Zane had on new Nike shoes that retailed for over $300. They were spending money they didn't have while hawking their dead mother's jewelry to fund their lifestyle. "Good morning," Marcus said, his voice carefully neutral as Patricia had coached him. "You folks ready to proceed with the appraisal?" Luna smiled brightly and opened the jewelry box, revealing Harper's engagement ring, wedding band, pearl earrings, and a sapphire pendant I'd given her for our 5th anniversary. "We brought everything this time. Our grandmother always said this collection should stay together, but we've decided to liquidate some assets to help with family expenses." The lies rolled off her tongue so smoothly. Harper's grandmother had died when Luna was 8 years old, and Harper had inherited exactly one piece of costume jewelry from her, a small silver locket worth maybe $50 that wasn't even in this collection. Zane leaned against the counter casually. "We've been dealing with estate issues since our stepfather died last year, and the probate process has been really expensive. These pieces have just been sitting in a safe deposit box, and we figured Grandma would want them to help us through this difficult time." "My stepfather died last year?" I was very much alive, sitting 20 feet away listening to them plan my fictional funeral. Patricia squeezed my shoulder to keep me calm as we continued recording their performance. Marcus examined each piece carefully, making notes about clarity, settings, and approximate retail value. These are beautiful pieces, obviously high quality. The engagement ring alone is probably worth 12 to 15,000 retail. The whole collection. He paused, doing mental calculations. I'd estimate total retail value around 45,000, but for immediate cash purchase, I could offer 28,000. Luna's eyes lit up. That would be perfect. We're actually leaving for a family vacation next week, a healing trip to honor our grandmother's memory, and this would cover all our expenses. A healing trip to honor Harper's memory, funded by selling her jewelry after violating her grave. The audacity was breathtaking. I'd seen their social media posts about the Belize vacation they'd booked. Luxury resort, private beach cabanas, deep-sea fishing excursions. Not exactly a grief retreat. I'll need to see some documentation before finalizing the sale, Marcus continued, following our script. Death certificates, estate paperwork, anything proving legal ownership of these items. Zane shifted uncomfortably. Well, the thing is, our stepfather is handling most of the legal stuff, and he's been pretty overwhelmed with grief. We didn't want to bother him with paperwork for items that were specifically left to us in our grandmother's verbal instructions. I understand family situations can be complicated, Marcus said diplomatically, but for items of this value, I need proper documentation. It's Virginia state law for purchases over $10,000. Luna pulled out her phone with obvious irritation. Let me call our stepfather and see if he can email us copies of the estate documents. He's usually pretty good about handling business stuff quickly. I almost laughed, watching her scroll through her contacts looking for my number. She was about to call the man she'd just claimed was dead, sitting 30 feet away recording every word of her fraud attempt. Patricia leaned over and whispered, "This is perfect evidence. They're not just stealing. They're committing identity fraud, insurance fraud, and lying to a licensed dealer about the source of stolen goods. We've got them on multiple felonies." "Should I answer when she calls?" I whispered back. "Let it go to voicemail first. We want to see how far they'll take this charade." Sure enough, Luna held the phone to her ear for 30 seconds, then hung up with a frustrated sigh. "He's not answering. Probably in meetings. You know how business owners are always busy." She tried calling again immediately, and this time I could see her growing more agitated when it went straight to voicemail again. Zane was checking his own phone nervously, probably wondering why their supposedly dead stepfather wasn't available to provide documentation for stealing his late wife's jewelry. "Tell you what," Marcus said finally. "Why don't you folks get that paperwork sorted out and come back tomorrow? I'll hold these items overnight and we can complete the transaction once everything's properly documented." "Actually," Luna said quickly, "we're flying out Sunday morning, so we really need to complete this today. Can we take a smaller amount now and provide documentation later?" It was fascinating watching them get desperate in real time. "I'm sorry, but I can't make any purchases without proper documentation," Marcus said firmly. State regulations are very strict about jewelry transactions, especially when the items appear to be estate pieces. I could lose my license. Luna's facade was starting to crack. "Look, we're not trying to cause problems here. These pieces have been in our family for decades. Our stepfather gave us permission to handle this transaction because he's too emotionally fragile to deal with selling our grandmother's things." Zane jumped in to support her story. "He's been really struggling since Grandma passed. We're basically handling all the estate stuff for him because he can barely function. He'd be devastated if he knew we were having to sell these pieces, but we need the money for family expenses." Patricia handed me a notepad and wrote, "Let them dig deeper. The more lies on recording, the stronger our case." Marcus nodded sympathetically. "I understand this is difficult. Family situations after a death are always complicated. But if your stepfather is the executor of the estate, I really need his signature on the sale authorization. Could you call him again and put him on speakerphone? I could walk him through the documentation requirements." This was the moment of truth. Luna looked at Zane nervously, then back at Marcus. He's actually not great with technology. He's kind of old-fashioned about business transactions. Could we maybe have him come in later today?" "Of course," Marcus agreed. "What time works best for him?" The siblings exchanged panicked glances. They'd painted themselves into a corner by claiming I was too grief-stricken to function, but also claiming I'd given them permission to sell Harper's jewelry. Now they had to produce a living person they'd just spent 10 minutes describing as emotionally devastated and barely functional. Maybe around 3 o'clock? Luna suggested weakly. Perfect. I'll have everything appraised and ready for his review. What's his name, by the way? I like to have proper documentation for my records. Another pause. They'd been so focused on their lies about Harper's fictional grandmother that they'd forgotten to coordinate their story about my supposed condition. Brian, Zane said finally. Brian Mitchell. He's been our stepfather for about 12 years. My blood pressure spiked hearing them use my name in their fraud scheme. They were literally planning to impersonate me later that afternoon, probably with some accomplice they'd recruited to pose as the grieving widower. Excellent, Marcus said, writing down the information. Brian Mitchell at 3 o'clock. I'll have contracts ready for his signature. Luna grabbed the jewelry box and headed for the door, clearly wanting to escape before more questions arose. Great, we'll see you then. And thank you for being so understanding about our family situation. After they left, Patricia and I reviewed the recording to ensure we'd captured everything clearly. Their voices came through perfectly, documenting multiple felonies, fraud, identity theft, conspiracy to commit fraud, and desecration of a grave site. They're going to show up at 3 o'clock with someone pretending to be you, Patricia observed. Probably some friend they've recruited who doesn't understand the severity of what they're participating in. I was already formulating the next phase of my plan. Let's make sure we give them that opportunity. I want this case to be absolutely ironclad when we turn it over to the Commonwealth Attorney. Patricia agreed. The more crimes they commit, the longer their sentences will be. And attempted identity fraud is a serious felony in Virginia. I spent the next 4 hours coordinating with Patricia and Marcus to set up additional recording equipment and arrange for Richmond Police Detective Sarah Williams to be present during the afternoon appointment. Detective Williams specialized in financial crimes and elder fraud, and she was very interested in our case once Patricia explained the scope of the conspiracy. We see this pattern occasionally, Detective Williams told me. Adult children who view their aging parents as ATM machines and inheritance opportunities rather than family members. But grave robbing adds a level of depravity that makes this case particularly prosecutable. At 2:30, we were all in position. Marcus had the jewelry display ready, Detective Williams was hidden in the back office with recording equipment, and Patricia was stationed outside to photograph whoever showed up claiming to be me. At exactly 3 o'clock, Zane and Luna returned with a man in his 60s who bore absolutely no resemblance to me. He was shorter, heavier, with gray hair and glasses, probably someone they'd recruited from a temp agency or hired through some online service, not realizing they were making him an accessory to multiple felonies. The moment the fake Brian Mitchell walked into the pawn shop, Detective Williams began photographing him through the one-way mirror while I watched in complete disbelief. They'd actually recruited some stranger to impersonate me in a felony fraud scheme. The man looked nervous, constantly glancing at Luna for reassurance as she coached him through their rehearsed story. "This is our stepfather, Brian," Luna announced to Marcus with forced cheerfulness. "He's feeling much better today and ready to handle the paperwork." The imposter extended his hand to Marcus. "Good afternoon. I understand you have some jewelry that belonged to my late wife that needs to be processed for sale." His voice was completely wrong, higher pitched than mine, with a slight New York accent. Anyone who'd ever met me would immediately know this wasn't the same person. But Marcus played along perfectly, treating the situation as if it were completely normal. "Of course, Mr. Mitchell. I have everything appraised and ready for your review. These are beautiful pieces. Your wife had excellent taste in jewelry." The fake Brian nodded solemnly. Harper always loved fine jewelry. She would have wanted these pieces to help the family during difficult times, rather than sitting unused. Hearing a stranger use my dead wife's name in this charade made my hands shake with rage. Detective Williams placed a steadying hand on my shoulder as we continued documenting every word of their performance. Marcus began showing the jewelry pieces individually, explaining their appraised values and his purchase offer. The imposter nodded and made appropriate grieving widower comments, clearly following a script Luna had provided. But he made several critical mistakes that proved he knew nothing about Harper or our relationship. "Yes, I remember buying her that pearl necklace for our anniversary," he said, pointing to earrings Harper had inherited from her aunt. "And the sapphire ring was a birthday gift. The sapphire piece was actually a pendant, not a ring, and I'd given it to Harper for our 5th anniversary, not her birthday. Luna kept shooting him warning looks, obviously realizing he was screwing up details that a real husband would never forget. But they were too deep into the fraud to back out now. I'll need to see some identification before we can finalize the transaction, Marcus said, following Detective Williams' instructions to gather as much evidence as possible. The imposter reached into his wallet and handed over a Virginia driver's license. Marcus examined it carefully, then looked up with a confused expression. "This says your name is Robert Chen, not Brian Mitchell." The silence in the shop was deafening. Luna's face went white as she realized their hired accomplice had just handed over his real identification in the middle of a fraud scheme. "Oh, that's his old license," Luna stammered, her voice cracking under pressure. "He's been having issues with the DMV updating his name after some paperwork problems. The new license is still being processed." Marcus nodded as if this explanation made perfect sense. "I understand bureaucracy can be frustrating, but I'll need identification that matches the name on the estate documentation. Do you have anything else that shows Brian Mitchell?" Robert Chen, now clearly realizing he'd been recruited for something illegal, started backing toward the door. "You know what? Maybe we should come back when the paperwork is sorted out properly. This seems more complicated than you folks described." "No, wait," Zane said desperately, grabbing the man's arm. "We can figure this out. Maybe if we call the DMV and explain the situation." But Robert Chen had apparently figured out that normal people don't recruit strangers to impersonate dead relatives at pawn shops. "I think there's been a misunderstanding about what kind of help you needed. I'm going to leave now." He hurried out of the shop, leaving Zane and Luna standing there with their fraud scheme collapsing in real time. Luna was visibly panicking, probably calculating how many laws they'd just broken in front of a licensed dealer who was required to report suspicious transactions. "Perhaps we should reschedule," Marcus suggested helpfully. "Give you folks time to get the proper documentation sorted out." "Actually," Detective Williams said, stepping out of the back office with her badge displayed, "I think we're ready to have a conversation right now." The look of absolute terror on Luna's face was satisfying in a way I hadn't expected. She grabbed Zane's arm as Detective Williams continued speaking. "Luna and Zane, you're both under arrest for conspiracy to commit fraud, identity theft, and desecration of a grave site. You have the right to remain silent." As Detective Williams read them their Miranda rights, I stepped out of the back office and watched their faces register the full horror of their situation. They'd been caught red-handed by the very man they'd been planning to defraud, and their entire conspiracy was documented on multiple recording devices. "Brian," Luna whispered in shock, But you thought I was stupid enough to let my stepchildren rob my dead wife's grave and steal her jewelry to fund your vacation," I said calmly. "You thought I wouldn't notice $45,000 worth of Harper's jewelry disappearing from her casket." The color drained completely from Zane's face as the full scope of their situation became clear. "We can explain everything," he said desperately. "This isn't what it looks like." "Really?" I pulled out my phone and played the recording of their conversation from an hour earlier. Their own voices filled the pawn shop. Luna claiming I was dead, Zane describing my fictional funeral expenses, both of them laughing about their healing vacation funded by Harper's stolen jewelry. Detective Williams finished handcuffing them while Patricia emerged from the back office with her investigation files. "Actually, this is exactly what it looks like. We've been documenting your fraud conspiracy for the past week, and we have evidence of much more than just today's attempted identity theft." I opened the folder Patricia handed me and began reading from their financial records. "You've been researching my life insurance policies for 8 months. You attempted to increase my coverage through an agent you contacted while pretending to be concerned about my financial protection. You've been accessing my bank accounts illegally and downloading information about my business assets." Luna started crying, but they weren't tears of remorse. They were tears of someone realizing they'd been caught in a scheme that was going to destroy their lives. "We weren't trying to hurt anyone. We just needed money for some temporary expenses." "Temporary expenses like a $12,000 luxury vacation to Belize," Patricia interjected, pulling out printouts of their travel bookings. "Oceanfront suites, private yacht charters, helicopter tours, all booked while you were planning to sell your dead mother's jewelry." Detective Williams secured their personal belongings as evidence while explaining the charges they were facing. "Virginia takes grave desecration very seriously. That's a Class 6 felony carrying up to 5 years in prison. Add the identity theft, fraud conspiracy and computer trespass charges, and you're both looking at significant prison time. Zane tried one last desperate appeal. Brian, you've got to understand. We've been struggling financially since Mom died. We thought you'd want to help us through this difficult time. The audacity was breathtaking. Help you? I've been helping you for over 2 decades. I paid for your college educations, covered your rent when you couldn't make payments, bought your cars, paid your insurance premiums. I spent $60,000 on experimental cancer treatments trying to save your mother's life while you two were researching how to collect my life insurance money. I pulled out Harper's handwritten note, the one I'd found in her jewelry box warning me about their suspicious behavior. Your mother knew what you were planning before she died. She left me this note warning me that Zane had been asking questions about my life insurance policy. She died knowing her own children were planning to profit from her death and mine. Luna's crying intensified as she realized Harper had discovered their conspiracy. She wasn't supposed to find out. We were just exploring options for financial security after she was gone. Financial security? Detective Williams looked disgusted. You violated your mother's grave to steal jewelry worth $45,000. You recruited a stranger to commit identity fraud. You illegally accessed bank accounts and researched murder methods to accelerate your inheritance timeline. This isn't financial planning. This is a criminal conspiracy. As they were led out in handcuffs, I felt a mixture of satisfaction and sadness watching Harper's children destroy their lives through greed and stupidity. They'd had a stepfather who genuinely cared about them, who'd provided financial support without asking for anything in return, who'd treated them like his own blood for over 20 years. Instead of appreciating that relationship, they'd viewed me as an obstacle between them and money they felt entitled to inherit. Marcus returned Harper's jewelry to me in the velvet box they'd stolen from our bedroom, holding those pieces again, the engagement ring I'd saved for months to buy, the pearls I'd surprised her with for our 10th anniversary, the sapphire pendant that marked our 5th year together, brought back memories of every special moment they represented. What happens now? I asked Detective Williams as we completed the paperwork. They'll be arraigned tomorrow morning. Given the severity of the charges and the premeditated nature of the conspiracy, I expect they'll be held without bail pending trial. The Commonwealth Attorney is very interested in this case. It's exactly the kind of elder fraud scheme they've been targeting for prosecution. Patricia handed me copies of all the evidence we'd gathered. You should also consider civil litigation to recover damages. They've cost you investigative fees, legal fees, emotional distress, and they've damaged your wife's final resting place. A civil suit could help ensure they face financial consequences even after their criminal sentences. I nodded, but my main concern wasn't financial recovery. I wanted justice for Harper and protection for other families who might face similar betrayals. Too many elderly people become victims of their own children's greed, and most cases never get discovered until it's too late. 3 days later, I sat in Commonwealth Attorney Jennifer Walsh's office, reviewing the formal charges against Zane and Luna. The evidence Patricia had compiled painted a picture of such calculated betrayal that even the prosecutor seemed shocked by the scope of their conspiracy. In 23 years of prosecuting financial crimes, I've rarely seen this level of premeditation from family members, Attorney Walsh said, spreading the evidence files across her conference table. They didn't just steal from you impulsively. They spent over a year planning every aspect of this fraud, including researching the best methods to accelerate your death. The computer forensics team had recovered Zane's internet search history, revealing months of research into natural-looking heart attack triggers, stress-induced cardiac events in men over 55, and undetectable substances that cause heart failure. He'd even downloaded articles about increasing life insurance payouts through apparent accidental death. Luna's employment at the estate planning firm was strategic, the prosecutor continued. She'd been learning Virginia inheritance laws specifically to identify the fastest way to access your assets after your death. Her supervisor confirmed she'd been asking detailed questions about probate procedures and life insurance beneficiary claims that had nothing to do with her assigned casework. I reviewed the timeline Patricia had constructed, showing how their planning had escalated after Harper's diagnosis. While I was focused on getting Harper the best possible medical care, spending our savings on experimental treatments and specialists, Zane and Luna were calculating exactly how much money they'd inherit when both of us were dead. The grave desecration was actually the least sophisticated part of their scheme, Attorney Walsh explained. They got impatient waiting for your natural death and decided to liquidate some assets immediately. But breaking into your bank accounts and researching murder methods shows this was heading towards something much more serious. Detective Williams joined our meeting with additional evidence from the investigation. We executed search warrants on both their apartments yesterday. Luna had a detailed financial spreadsheet showing your complete asset portfolio: bank accounts, investment accounts, business valuation, real estate holdings, life insurance policies. The total came to $2.3 million, which matches our forensic accounting almost exactly. The precision was chilling. They'd researched my net worth more thoroughly than I had myself, identifying assets I'd forgotten about and calculating the exact inheritance they'd receive under Virginia law. Zane had something even more disturbing, Detective Williams continued, pulling out an evidence bag containing a notebook. He'd been keeping a journal documenting your daily routines, exercise habits, stress levels, and potential health vulnerabilities. There are entries about your blood pressure medication, your work schedule, even notes about when you seemed most emotionally fragile after Harper's death. Reading Zane's handwritten observations about my grief and physical condition felt like being studied by a predator. He'd documented that I'd lost 15 pounds after Harper died, that I sometimes forgot to take my blood pressure medication when I was overwhelmed, that I'd started working longer hours to avoid being alone in our empty house. The most incriminating evidence is the insurance research, Attorney Walsh said, showing me printouts from Luna's computer. She'd contacted 3 different life insurance agents using your personal information, claiming to be your concerned stepdaughter. She was trying to add accidental death riders and increase your coverage amounts, apparently planning to make your eventual murder look like an accident. The evidence also revealed they'd been monitoring my credit reports and had attempted to open new credit cards in my name. They'd used my social security number to request copies of my tax returns and had even contacted my business insurance agent, asking questions about policy payouts in case of owner death or disability. They weren't just planning to inherit your existing assets, Detective Williams explained. They were actively working to maximize the financial benefit of your death while positioning themselves to access money immediately rather than waiting for probate. Attorney Walsh handed me the formal indictment listing 17 separate felony charges between them: conspiracy to commit murder, fraud, identity theft, grave desecration, computer trespass, forgery, attempted insurance fraud, and elder abuse. Virginia has some of the strictest elder fraud penalties in the country. If convicted on all charges, they're each facing 25 to 40 years in prison. The magnitude of their betrayal was still sinking in. These weren't desperate people who'd made a single bad decision. They were calculating criminals who'd spent over a year planning my murder while pretending to grieve their mother and accepting my continued financial support. There's one more thing, Detective Williams said hesitantly. The computer forensics team found evidence that they'd been researching your typical travel routes and schedules. They knew you drove to the Norfolk industrial plant every Tuesday for client meetings, always taking the same highway route. They'd identified several locations along that route where a staged car accident would look plausible. My Tuesday drives to Norfolk, a routine I'd maintained for 15 years, always leaving at the same time and taking Interstate 64 through rural stretches where accidents wouldn't have immediate witnesses. They'd been planning to murder me during a routine business trip, probably staging it to look like I'd fallen asleep at the wheel or had a medical emergency while driving. When is their arraignment? I asked, feeling emotionally drained by the scope of their conspiracy. Tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock. Given the severity of the charges and flight risk concerns, we're requesting they be held without bail pending trial. The arraignment hearing was surreal. Watching Zane and Luna in Orange County jail uniforms, shackled and flanked by public defenders, I barely recognized the young people I'd raised for over 2 decades. They looked smaller somehow, diminished by the weight of their crimes and the reality of their situation. Judge Margaret Harrison reviewed the 17 felony charges with obvious gravity. The defendants are charged with conspiracy to commit first-degree murder, multiple counts of fraud and identity theft, grave desecration, and elder abuse. These are extremely serious allegations involving a calculated conspiracy to murder the victim and steal his assets. Luna's public defender, a young woman who looked overwhelmed by the case complexity, requested bail consideration. Your Honor, my client has no prior criminal record and strong community ties. She's lived in Richmond her entire life and poses no flight risk. Commonwealth Attorney Walsh stood immediately. Your Honor, the evidence shows this defendant spent over a year planning the victim's murder while researching methods to make it appear accidental. She illegally accessed his financial accounts, attempted to increase his life insurance coverage, and violated her mother's grave to steal jewelry. The premeditation and sophistication of this conspiracy makes both defendants extremely dangerous to Mr. Mitchell and to the community. Judge Harrison reviewed the evidence summary for several minutes before making her decision. Based on the allegations of conspiracy to commit murder and the detailed planning involved, both defendants will be held without bail pending trial. The court finds substantial evidence of flight risk and potential danger to the victim. I felt a wave of relief hearing that decision. As long as they remained in custody, I could focus on rebuilding my life without worrying about further attempts on my safety. After the hearing, Attorney Walsh explained the plea bargain process. They'll probably be offered deals to avoid trial, especially if they agree to testify about the full scope of their planning. But given the evidence we have, I expect they'll both face significant prison time regardless. Over the following weeks, I began the difficult process of reconstructing my sense of security and family. Harper's sister, Margaret, who lived in Charlotte, had been horrified when I explained what her niece and nephew had been planning. She helped me arrange for Harper's jewelry to be properly secured and offered to help me redesign my will to ensure my assets would go to people who actually deserved them. Harper always worried that Luna and Zane were too focused on money, Margaret told me during one of our phone conversations. She mentioned several times that they asked inappropriate questions about your finances and seemed more interested in your assets than your relationship with their mother. I donated Zane and Luna's college fund money, approximately $40,000 I'd been saving for their potential graduate school expenses, to the Richmond Police Department's Financial Crimes Unit. Detective Williams told me the donation would help fund equipment and training to investigate similar elder fraud cases. My business required some restructuring as well. The stress of discovering the conspiracy had affected my concentration and client relationships. I decided to bring in a partner, Marcus Chen, ironically, the brother of Robert Chen who'd been recruited for the identity fraud scheme. Marcus was a younger engineer who could help modernize our operations while I gradually transitioned toward retirement. I never understood why my brother got involved with those people, Marcus told me during our partnership discussions. He said they offered him $500 to pose as someone's stepfather for a simple business transaction. He had no idea they were planning murder and insurance fraud until the police arrested him. Robert Chen had cooperated fully with the investigation in exchange for reduced charges. His testimony about how Zane and Luna recruited him provided additional evidence of their calculated approach to fraud. 6 months after the arraignment, both defendants accepted plea bargains rather than face trial. Luna pleaded guilty to conspiracy to commit second-degree murder, fraud, and grave desecration in exchange for 18 years in prison. Zane, who had been the primary planner, pleaded guilty to conspiracy to commit first-degree murder and received 25 years. They'll be eligible for parole in 12 and 18 years respectively, Attorney Walsh explained after the sentencing hearing. But Virginia's parole system is strict, especially for violent crimes. They'll likely serve most of their sentences. The civil lawsuit resulted in a judgment requiring them to pay restitution for investigative costs, legal fees, and emotional damages totaling $200,000. Since they had no assets beyond credit card debt, the judgment was mostly symbolic, but it established a legal record of their financial responsibility for the harm they'd caused. More importantly, the case resulted in new legislation strengthening Virginia's elder fraud penalties and requiring additional safeguards for gravesite access. Harper's story helped protect other families from similar betrayals. 2 years later, I'm sitting on the porch of my new home in Asheville, North Carolina, watching the Blue Ridge Mountains change colors with the autumn sunset. I moved here 6 months after the sentencing, needing distance from Richmond and all the memories associated with Harper's death and her children's betrayal. The industrial ventilation business sold for more than I'd expected, and Marcus Chen proved to be an excellent successor who maintained all my client relationships. The phone call from the pawn shop owner that started this whole revelation seems like a lifetime ago now. When Marcus called me about someone trying to sell Harper's diamond bracelet, I could never have imagined the scope of the conspiracy I was about to uncover. That single phone call saved my life and exposed a murder plot that had been developing for over a year. Margaret visits every few months, and we've developed a relationship that helps fill some of the family void left by Harper's death and her children's imprisonment. She's become the executor of my updated will, ensuring my assets will eventually support cancer research and victim advocacy programs rather than funding the lifestyles of people who viewed me as nothing more than a bank account with a pulse. The house here in Asheville is smaller than the Richmond home Harper and I shared, but it's peaceful in ways I hadn't experienced in years. I've got a workshop in the basement where I design custom ventilation systems for local craft breweries and distilleries. Interesting projects that keep my engineering skills sharp without the stress of running a major business operation. Dr. Patricia Williams, the private investigator who helped expose Zane and Luna's conspiracy, has become a close friend. Her expertise in financial fraud cases made her invaluable during the investigation, but more importantly, she helped me understand that I wasn't naive or stupid for trusting my stepchildren. Elder fraud by family members is unfortunately common, and even experienced professionals can miss the warning signs when they're grieving and emotionally vulnerable. The sophistication of their planning was extraordinary, Patricia reminded me during a recent visit. They studied you like a criminal enterprise studies a target. Most people would never suspect their own family members of conducting that level of surveillance in preparation for murder. I still think about Harper every day, but the grief has evolved from the sharp pain of loss to a warmer appreciation for the years we had together. Her jewelry collection is now safely stored in a bank vault here in Asheville, and I've designated it to be donated to a domestic violence shelter after my death. Women starting over often need resources to rebuild their lives, and Harper would have appreciated that purpose. The most satisfying outcome has been the legislative changes our case inspired. Harper's law requires additional documentation and waiting periods for gravesite access, making it much harder for family members to desecrate burial sites for financial gain. The law also strengthened penalties for elder fraud involving family members and required insurance companies to implement additional safeguards against fraudulent policy changes. Detective Williams sends me updates occasionally about similar cases the Richmond Police Department has solved using techniques developed during our investigation. The donation I made to their financial crimes unit helped purchase computer forensic equipment that's been instrumental in exposing other family fraud conspiracies. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if Marcus at the pawn shop hadn't been suspicious enough to call me about the jewelry. Zane and Luna would have continued their planning, probably succeeding in staging my accidental death within months. They'd be living comfortably on my life insurance money and inherited assets, having literally gotten away with murder. Instead, they're serving long prison sentences that will consume the prime years of their adult lives. Luna will be 44 when she's eligible for parole, and Zane will be 53. Their mother is gone, their stepfather wants nothing to do with them, and they've destroyed any possibility of normal family relationships or financial security. The irony is that if they'd simply been patient and maintained a loving relationship with me, they would have inherited everything eventually anyway. I'm 60 years old now, and my will had originally left them my entire estate. Their greed and impatience turned them from beneficiaries into criminals, trading a multi-million-dollar inheritance for decades in prison. As I watch the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and purple, I feel grateful for the phone call that exposed their betrayal before it was too late. Harper's memory is safe, her jewelry is protected, and her children have faced justice for their crimes. Most importantly, I'm alive to enjoy the peace I've found here in North Carolina, surrounded by natural beauty and genuine relationships with people who value me for who I am, rather than what I'm worth. The pawnshop owner's call didn't just save my life. It gave me the opportunity to build a new one based on truth rather than manipulation, surrounded by people who care about my well-being rather than my bank account balance. That's the best memorial I could possibly create for Harper's memory.